Welcome, everyone. It's my great pleasure to be joined today by my friend Conor McKee. And Conor is, well, he has left academia, but he certainly hasn't given up the life of the mind. I have had many very wonderful and pleasant conversations with Conor on a variety of subjects. And his thesis focused on Piers Plowman and the Sacraments of nature. So we're going to be discussing, maybe mostly focusing on Augustine and Augustine's Platonism, his theory of memory, and his theory of creation, how it is that, at least according to Augustine and others, we find in creation signs of the divine. So Conor, it's a great pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much, Johannes. So what I'm going to be talking about today is really the substance of a thesis I wrote at Cambridge, which I've been developing at the moment into an academic book. So in this work, I think, I suppose, about the fundamental problem that's posed to the narrator beginning of this poem, Piers Plowman. It's a 14th century dream poem.
Yeah.
It was written in the late 14th century, broadly contemporary with Chaucer in the reign of Richard II. And it's a poem that's concerned with the meaning of life. And the meaning of life is also then an epistemic question. It's how can we know things that are beyond this world, within this world? And for Langland, as a Catholic writer, this is a question of how we can know God. So these questions about the sacraments and nature are intertwined with this bigger epistemic issue. How can we know God? How can we know truth?
Yeah,
that's what I focus on in this work.
And yeah, feel free to go on. Sorry.
Well, the relationship between these two things, I think, is connected to how Langland thinks about creation, or rather how his society thinks about creation, because I think Langland in many ways is the inheritor of a prior tradition. So it's not to say that Langland is innovating in this. I think Langland is receiving and developing an existing tradition. And this is a tradition that goes all the way back to the Gospel of John,
yeah,
and its interpretation by Platonist thinkers. We can take that all the way back to Origen of Alexandria. But the thinker that I pick out in my work as particularly influential is Pseudo-Dionysius, who leaves a long legacy in the West, particularly in relation to sacramental thinking.
So yeah, you begin with mentioning of the Gospel of John, Enache and Hologos. In the beginning was Logos, was the word. I think you would probably prefer as a translation. How do you see that then connecting to Piers Plowman, to that poem?
So to say that the universe is the product of the divine Logos is to say that this is a universe that is patterned, that is full of symbols that might be read mystically, that might lead us towards God. And this question for Langland of how we can find God in the material world is a question then, I suppose, of unpicking the divine symbols, of finding this principle of organization that lies behind individual material things. All of this for Langland is, of course, mediated also by the dream, which is a space that is only sort of quasi-material. It reflects on things we've seen in the waking world, in the material world, but it's also this kind of transient liminal space. And that is where Langland sort of meets this problem. I look particularly at the sacraments because in the 13th century, the sort of rubber hits the roads for the sacraments. People have faced a series of Eucharistic heresies, and the church feels the need to justify these rituals that have always been part of Christian practice.
Yeah.
But suddenly there's a need to actually come up with some kind of robust theory. People, of course, had thought seriously about the sacraments before. I don't want to suggest otherwise. There's certainly much in the work of the Church Fathers. But this is a moment where you get much more developed systematic thinking. And I think the Logos concept becomes very important in underpinning thinking about the sacraments, because this Greek emanationist tradition that interprets the Logos concept sees the sacraments as a layer of a material hierarchy that's produced by creation, a layer of it's a hierarchy of symbols, and the sacraments are that layer just above us as human beings, as inhabitants of the universe, and that layer is what we must pass through, what mediates our engagement with the supernatural world, and what mediates our engagement with God. So that's how the logos concept, I think, ties into this sacramental element to the poem that I highlight.
So in matrimony or confirmation, we enact in a way, or reenact creation in a sense, or come closer to it.
Yes, so it's the sacrament is that the word itself is, I suppose, a Roman legal term. It's something that's binding, that's something that acts upon us. But the sacraments themselves often have a res et signum, a thing, and something they symbolize, something they represent. Something that's quite interesting is this material element. Now, it's harder to find the res in some of them than others. It's harder to identify in perhaps matrimony what that is. Perhaps it's the spoken word. Theologians do pin these things down. An easy example is that of baptism. You have the physical element of water. And what's interesting there is that the power of the sacrament, what it does metaphysically, and its significance is tied into the physical thing itself. So Hugh of St. Victor, one of the theologians I noticed an influence on Langland, he picks out baptism, and he says the three persons of the Trinity act upon it in institution. So you have the creation of the material element, water, and something of that water, its wetness, its capacity as a solvent to wash things away, then preempts its later role, which is manifested through grace, in its ability to wash away original sin, which is Augustine's description of the efficacy of the sacrament of baptism. So you have in the created sign some suggestion of what it will later do. This is then, I suppose, a historical understanding of the sacraments, that the sacraments develop through salvation history, and they are created to do one thing, and then they are instituted by Christ in the Gospels, and then through the work of the Church supported by the Holy Spirit, they do something further. So there's a development of the sign in history. That, I think, is really important to Hugh of St. Victor, and it's one of the things that underpins this sort of defense of the sacraments in later medieval theology.
And why did that defense, maybe more particularly, become necessary? Was it there was obviously not a time of rising atheism or so, but why do you think was there a need to almost prove them?
It may not be a time of atheism, but that's not to say that elements of Christian practice don't start to look redundant to some thinkers.
Yeah.
So in particular, you have Berengar of Tours and later John Wycliffe, who both move in the direction of symbolic understandings of what is happening in the Eucharist. Anne Hudson's famous book, Premature Reformation, suggests that Wycliffe's move is a sort of suggestion of things to come in the 16th century. So the Catholic Church is trying to, I think, defend the metaphysical importance of the sacraments, not just defend why we should continue to do this thing, but why does it matter? Why might God be really present in the host? Or why might sin be actually removed by baptism? And this thing is not merely a kind of just a gesture to the flood or something.
It's not a simple gesture or an initiation rite to enter the church or become a member of the community, but it is indeed a metaphysical act that binds together the material and the immaterial world. Would that be?
Absolutely, that's it. So that, I think, is what particularly Hugh of St. Victor and Hugh of St. Victor is copied to some extent by a thinker called Peter Lombard, who becomes the sort of classic scholastic textbook of the later Middle Ages, his work, The Sentences. So these thinkers are both, I think, responding to writers like Berengar, not to Wycliffe, they precede Wycliffe, but it's very much in the air in the late Middle Ages, this need to defend the sacraments.
That's fascinating. You know, for some reason, my mind is going to Hölderlin's proclamation that the gods have flown the earth, and so, or put it differently, that the divine has disappeared. And it's of course much later than this particular epoch. But I wonder why you think that the metaphysical element is, let's just assume, for some time understood and accepted and not even questioned. But all of a sudden it becomes more, well, a symbolic interpretation or allegorical, so that it basically loses its metaphysical substance or significance. Do you have any idea why that might be? Is that just a sort of a moment of decline? There's something similar happens in Greek mythology, where, strangely enough, especially Aristotle, through allegory, saves much of myth, but and the Stoics also, in their allegorical interpretation and reinterpretation of the myths as really just physics, basically. But the original content gets lost.
So it's worth saying these are stirrings in the academy. These are all learned critics. It's not to say that there's a great loss of faith in the power of the sacraments among the laity. I mean, historians like Eamon Duffy suggest exactly the contrary, that there's this great fascination with the magical and the mysterious elements of Christian practice. But I think part of the reason that you do maintain this strong commitment to the metaphysical power of the sacraments throughout the late Middle Ages is that this is an effective, this Platonist picture that I discuss in my work is an effective counter to what people like Berengar and Wycliffe write. It is a convincing, if you buy into certain premises, of course, it is a convincing way of thinking about how material things are necessary for our salvation. Hugh of St. Victor evokes this famous Augustinian image of the three eyes. He points out, we have a sort of an eye of the flesh, an eye of reason, and a spiritual eye, an eye of contemplation. And through the fall, our eye of contemplation, our eye to see God has been blinded, our eye of reason has been blurred, and only the eye of the flesh can see. Well, Hugh of St. Victor thinks that the sacraments are the way that we can unblur and unblind those two other eyes. The sacraments, maybe perhaps not completely, but they allow us to regain glimpses of God through these other eyes. So I think you're right to say that in other periods you've had these sort of complete losses of faith in the metaphysical underpinnings of religion, and religion becomes a social practice alone. I don't think that's happening in the late Middle Ages. It's more of a sort of academic critique that's being addressed.
How do you then understand? Because I remember in one of the chapters on Christian Platonism, you referred to you work a bit on Augustine, on De Genesi ad litteram, for example, but you point out that it's an allegorical title, so it's not taken ad litteram by the letter, but allegorically. In what sense allegorically, and how would that affect in what we've just been discussing on the symbolic reinterpretation?
So I think in choosing that title, Augustine is talking about going back to the text as opposed to moral and tropological readings. So as I say, it is an allegorical reading, but he's trying to sort of set that against much more sort of fanciful styles of reading that you might find in kind of in sermons. So it goes to the text, but it still reads it allegorically. And I would say until perhaps, sort of, maybe 20th century American evangelical practice, you don't really have that sort of widespread literalism in Christian teaching. You find Henri de Lubac's great work, The Four Senses of Scripture, or Medieval Exegesis. It takes as a given that almost all the great exegetes of antiquity in the Middle Ages are working from a structure that Scripture works on multiple levels simultaneously. So there's always an allegorical dimension. And that's particularly true of the Old Testament, where these are poetic books. They have refrains. They are structured as verse when you look at the original text. So I think that Augustine's allegorical move is consistent with going back to the letter. But did you have something else in mind, more specific, when you drew attention to this allegorical element?
Well, perhaps. Well, just briefly, because you were mentioning 20th century evangelicalism, that's of course what the so-called new atheists responded to. They didn't actually engage with, for example, say Augustine or the rest of Christian theology as developed over thousands of years, but with the most, let's say, literal take of Scripture.
They built a sort of straw man the size of the Wicker Man. Yeah.
But very briefly, how would you understand then Christ's ascent into heaven? Is that to be taken literally, or the
So how would I, or how would someone in the 14th century? I would tend to say that the features of the text would signal how we should approach it exegetically. So the Old Testament books might call for a freer style of reading because they are framed as poetry, whereas the sort of Greco-Roman biography format of the New Testament documents or epistolary format of the documents suggests that they are attempts to record something historical. So probably a narrower spectrum of interpretation is called for. But that's not to say that you couldn't, on top of taking that sort of more straightforward reading, attribute allegorical significance to those events. That is very common certainly in medieval preaching, to see prefiguration. Indeed, it's common, I suppose, even in Paul's letters. You'll have moments of allegorical reading where Christ is the new David, where he's of David's line, but that's not really what Paul's getting at. Paul is saying that he's a fulfillment of what David was in his kingly nature. So Christ as Lord of the universe is enacting this. So that the two senses need not be at odds with each other.
So also this an allegorical reading of Genesis, of the creation, need not be anti or non-metaphysical. Then it can be. It can actually even support the metaphysics underpinning the narrative or what's put forth.
Yeah, absolutely. If you have a kind of non-reductive view of truth, where truth can be framed in stories that are in myths and things that are true without being, reducible to propositions that an analytic philosopher might be satisfied by, I think there's no problem there. Yeah, and with allegory, I mean, one of the fascinating issues is, of course, that whilst you can stack these many readings and build continuity, there will always be some degree of tension. And Piers Plowman, it's worth saying at this point, is an allegorical poem. So the dream is often operating on that level where tensions emerge between a literal and figurative reading. Figures will change identity. So my former supervisor, Nicolette Zeeman, is fascinated by this trope called Paradisasterly, This is the redefinition of a word. It's a technique in classical rhetoric where you slip up your opponent by using a word in different senses, so that they agree to something under one sense of the word, and it becomes something else that you can use to your advantage. In the same way, Langland redefines his characters such that we become familiar with them, we trust them, and then they reveal themselves to be a vice and not a virtue, under a secondary meaning of that word that we didn't have at the forefront of our mind in the moment.
Do you have an example from the
Yeah,
text?
there are lots of good ones. The most obvious one that comes to mind is the figure of meed. Meed is a Middle English word that means reward, but it can also mean bribery. It can mean the principle of fair exchange that's necessary to keep an economy going, or it can be lucre and mammon and corruption. So meed is introduced as this treacherous figure. He is about to be betrothed to the devil. The way she's described fits with historical accounts of Edward III's mistress, Alice Perez. So there's a sort of, for Langland's readers, it would be a kind of notorious fallen woman that she's likened to implicitly. And then she's put on trial by the king at the advice of their sort of figures of virtue, particularly conscience. And in this moment where the questions are put to her under oath, when she's cross-examined, she reveals herself to be necessary for the workings of the entire polity, because exchange is fundamental to how the king's court operates, whether it's favors, the giving of money and taxation. And she reveals herself through this slippage in the word from meda as bribery to meda as exchange. She transforms herself and she gets off the charges by doing that. So that's an obvious example. There are more complicated ones as well, and there are positive ones too.
That's fascinating, because I think that gets to something about languages, translations, especially because Augustine, when they're reading, Augustine, I think, writes in Latin, but he must have been reading scripture in ancient Greek, I suppose, and not Hebrew, and there may have been Latin translations. And go on.
I think the word, but he would have had a fairly sophisticated education, at least if what we read in confessions is something to go by. So he knew Greek texts. We see him. He writes about I think Plotinus and others in Book 10 of the City of God. He shows a deep awareness of classical culture beyond the Roman world.
Yeah, because in a way, I mean, I'm only just beginning to be fascinated by allegory for the reason that I think it is crucial to make sense of memory. So maybe you can go in that direction now as well. What's important with regards to memory in your work. But it seems that language quite often has to be allegorical. Words have to be allegorical, have to have, let's say, multiple dimensions of meaning, and cannot always just point to, well, it cannot just be one sign that signifies one thing. To also come back to another very important topic of your work. So I'd just like to, well, give you now the floor to expand on any of this, and also maybe go in the direction of memory and signs again.
So the meaning of language is constructed by situations. It's the famous sort of Wittgensteinian, the language game, but rules are highly context sensitive, and that's why some of these figures in the poem can be redefined. Langland has the advantage of the dream frame as well, because in our dreams, people do change identity. We can move between fantastical things that wouldn't make diegetic sense. You couldn't write in a 19th century realist novel. So yes, there's this sort of play on the contextual redefinition of words. I focus on this point before I get to memory. I focus on figure of patience quite a lot in the second half of the thesis. And patience is an interesting figure because he is at once the patience in the sense that is familiar to us in the English language of waiting patiently, but it's also patientia, it's suffering, and perhaps pateo in Latin, that to be open. So I think patience throughout that second part becomes a very important virtue, as suffering in a confessional context gives rise to an openness to grace and a forbearance of one's own will, which is then what allows one to cooperate with God's will. So I think in terms of the mechanics of grace, which are much in dispute in the late Middle Ages, Aquinas sort of famously kind of anatomizes grace in great detail. This process of cooperation, of how the will can be brought into line, the human will can be brought into line with the divine will, is very important. On memory, are you thinking, I suppose, of my discussion of Augustine and the tripartite theory of mind in De Trinitate?
Yes.
Yeah. So Augustine thinks of, he goes into, I suppose, what it is to be made in the image of God as something more than just a statement of the dignity of mankind. It's also to say that we are a kind of Trinity. We have the faculties of memory, intellect, and will. And those faculties cooperate continually in a kind of perichoresis, a sort of rotation, which is like the co-interaction of the different persons of the Christian Trinity. They're also indivisible. So what is it to remember something without the will to remember something specific, or the intellect to actually constitute that thing? What is it to exercise one's will without remembering an object to will, or to desire? So memory is part of that process. I think what's particularly interesting for me is the way in which sin affects the mind, because I'm writing in this work against a tradition, a kind of optimistic tradition of reading Langland. I too, in some ways, am optimistic about the possibilities of knowing God, and I do think the poet makes moral progress in the course of the narrative. But what I'm resisting is, I think, an intellectualist reading of the poem that assumes that if we just think hard enough, that will get us to God. I think you need this element of sacramental mediation, which is very important in 14th century culture. It's very important in what I think is the intellectual background for Langland, the sources he's working with, these penitential manuals, these works of Latin pastoral theology, like the Sentences and Hugh of St. Victor's De Sacramentis. So memory comes in there because I think in the tripartite theory that Augustine has, the effects of sin breaks down that cooperative process, the interaction between the different elements of the mind. That makes us less godlike in some way. It makes us contemplate things that are lower goods rather than the highest good. So that I think is where memory comes into my argument.
Memory, is there a sense of a of a memory? Well, are we in a sense the memory of creation? Are we in a sense the memory of the Trinity in the flesh, as it were?
Well, Augustine uses this term, vestigia Trinitatis, that there's a sort of an imprint of the Trinity, trace. So that I suppose is like a memory. What the process that you have, I suppose, in Neoplatonist accounts of creation, going back to Plotinus and his successors, is this going out and this return, a procession and a return, and that's an element of semiotic thinking, that the thing that's referred to must be distinguished from the sign, but the sign must also refer to it. So it's a kind of a going out and a coming in. It's not the same as, otherwise it wouldn't be a linguistic signpost at all. It would just be the thing. But that also applies to the creative act. That Plotinus talks about this emanation of the divine nature. Christian thinkers, of course, have to be careful about that language, because it suggests a sort of a non-conscious element to creation, that God's goodness just overflowed, which is not what Christians want to think. They want to think that God creates from nothing, and he does so purposefully. But that emanation will also ultimately lead to a return, which is the story of salvation history, whereby humans who have sinned and fallen away will be brought back in conformity with God, and they will then have the beatific vision in heaven. They'll have this opportunity to see God without the glass darkly of 1 Corinthians. So yes, I think there is this. There is something like a memory there, but there's also a hope that it will be more than a memory, that we will have a greater closeness to God than we have had thus far.
But obviously after salvation, or with salvation, which is not guaranteed. Let's put it bluntly.
It's not guaranteed, exactly, and it's also mediated by elements of the material world that have been set apart, the sacraments. So we can't just jump across the ontological gap and be with our Creator. We have to work our way through the moral maze, and we have to use this mediating structure. There are many mediating structures. So Dionysius gives us the angelic hierarchy, the ecclesiastical hierarchy. All of these hierarchies have to be sort of used as tools to get towards God.
How, in this view, though, does then the material and our acts in the material realm, if that's even appropriate to say or think, influence, if that's the immaterial, or have any impact on it, or at least to its apparent presence in, for example, in signs, also insofar as creation, as you point out, is continuous, at least for God, and not an event of the past.
Yes, God, as Aquinas famously pointed out, God is holding us all in being at every moment, and he could cease that if he chose it. I think the idea of participation is important here. It's a difficult term to pin down, to define. I make an important distinction between a purely intellectual understanding of participation, which is, I suppose, to recover the forms through rational work and observation of the material world. That is, I think, how that is prioritized by Plato himself. But for later Platonists, there's a move away from that, particularly the Syrian thinker Iamblichus. And it's actually that strand that comes to influence Christianity very, very significantly, particularly through this writer Pseudo-Dionysius. And one of the reasons for that is, I think, that participation there involves ritual practice, not just contemplation. It's not at odds with contemplation, but it involves some sort of process of us actually being, we need the correct disposition, we need the correct will. And this is all found in sacramental theology. The sacrament is not adequately received merely by fulfilling the ritual criterion. One also has to do so with the proper disposition. If you're a priest who doesn't want to get ordained and gets ordained at shotgun point, you're not validly ordained because you didn't have the proper disposition. So participation there involves an alignment of ourself with the good that we want to receive, and also and involvement with these material signs that are involved in the process of mediation. So it's both of those things together. So we're not, I suppose, when you ask about influencing the spiritual realm, we're not sort of remaking heaven in that way, but we are influencing it in that we acquire sort of spiritual knowledge, and we might make moral progress through engaging with material things that are our kind of bridge.
And yet man remains a fallen creature, or the fallen creature, which to later thinkers, Renaissance thinkers, is the moment of freedom, especially then post-Renaissance. Hegel would make the argument that without the fall, there would be no human freedom. This is something that perhaps I think also already Augustine struggles with, and Kant fully rejects Augustine and becomes a Pelagian in his religion within the bounds of mere reason. Of course, he was Protestant. So I wonder, though, in how that factors in our fallenness and our to speak with Kant, our propensity for evil.
Yeah, I suppose to some extent this is the issue of the Felix Culpa, that there might be a greater cosmic good for us to have fallen, which is a difficult thing to say, and is sort of reluctantly admitted when it is admitted by Christian theologians. Whether that's a greater good because God shows more of himself to us by being merciful, whether it's a greater good because it allows for freedoms that we would otherwise be deprived of if we were kind of pure automatons. Either way, I think it has the same effect. But to be, I suppose, saved is to be confirmed in one's will, at least for Aquinas. So it's not to be deprived of will, it's to have used one's free will already, and to have done so with the intention of persisting in a particular state. So to die in a state of grace, having lived the right kind of life and had faith, is then to use that freedom in a particular way. I suppose also it depends on what you think freedom is. I mean, this is I think a timely thing to discuss, because there are lots of many people think of freedom purely in terms of what you might call the leeway condition of freedom. That freedom is having more options in the given moment. In which case, perhaps to shoot yourself or something might be a freedom. But you could also say, of course, that deprives you of many future choices. So it's actually to limit your freedom. So a different conception of freedom that you find in the Christian tradition is a freedom to pursue the good. Paul writes in his letters that man is a slave to sin, that he wills something but does the opposite. And he finds that he's a puzzle to himself, just as Augustine is puzzled by himself in Confessions, because of this conflict between his will and what he actually does. So if we're not neutral creatures when we exercise our will, if we don't actually have a free choice because we default towards our basest nature, then perhaps the freedom to pursue the good, knowing that you could do otherwise, is actually a more potent conception of freedom than this leeway condition of freedom of just having more things on the table in a given moment. In which case, I suppose there is something to be said for the picture we have of a fallen world, but one that can be redeemed.
There's sometimes I think that perhaps it is about the leeway condition, but also about so not just freedom of a multiplicity of almost seemingly endless choices, but also a rampant negative freedom, one that wants to be liberated from, when we want to be liberated from just about any constraint, including natural limitation.
Yes, Wordsworth said he'd felt the weight of too much liberty, and anyone who's done a PhD has felt that. To be truly free is then to be paralyzed by indecision, or to waste your time on things that are actually not very fulfilling. not to say that my whole PhD was spent that way, but there are certainly days when having no routine, no structure means that you don't do anything productive. Of course, other times you succeed in imposing a structure yourself, but you are then always you make something of it by ordering the chaos yourself. I mean, this is also what we do with language, that language is something that's structured and constrained that allows us to communicate. We couldn't talk at all if we weren't talking in grammatical sentences, if we did away with the limitations of language. So these constraints can enable, and poetry is the ultimate example of this, is deliberately affecting additional restrictions on one's use of language in order to say things better.
Yeah, Schelling comes to mind to explicitly, as he puts it, things together, necessity and freedom. And perhaps though now to take it to end in a bit of, maybe not that of a different direction, but to come back to the beginning, but also to add something to it. There are signs of the divine in nature, but are there signs also of evil, of the diabolical, of Satan, or in a specific sense of the Luciferian, so the one who brings light, but a kind of light that misguides or misdirects. As you point out yourself, Augustine was a Manichaean for some time. You can go into that for people who don't know what Manichaeanism is. So are we perhaps also addressed by signs not only from God, but also from his opponent?
Yes, so Augustine was briefly possessed by a sort of dualist cosmology of God in conflict with an inferior deity, but found this ultimately unconvincing. The question of whether there are signs of the diabolical nature, I would say no, but that the diabolical is present. The way I would make sense of that is by thinking about evil in the same way that Augustine does, as a kind of lack or absence, a sort of metaphysical nothing, or as a disordering. That what happens in Eden is arguably not to choose evil at all; it's to choose a lesser good. The apple is something made by God. God's creation is all good. We're told this on the sixth day, but the prohibition is the prohibition not to do something that is beneath, or is selected by God to be beneath man. So it is pursue a lower good than the good that is purposed for man. It's not to fulfill one's teleology. So I think that is what's going on also with what you might call the kind of diabolical signs, if you want to call them that. I wouldn't call them that, in that I don't think anything is created by the devil.
Exactly. Yeah.
So they are. It is merely a kind of anarchy that has erupted within creation as a product of the fall. You see this particularly in the poem in passages B11, which is where this is a sort of contentious passage. Almost all of the poem is contentious in some way because it's this very complicated dream allegory. It opens itself up to many interpretations, but this passage particularly is interesting for me because Will, the narrator, significantly named, I think, is brought up a mountain by Kinder. Kinder means nature in Middle English, but it can also mean all sorts of other things. It's a complex word. I spend a good 15 pages or something discussing all of those meanings in the book. But Will then looks out on creation and he sees the animals and he envies them. He envies them, but he also thinks that they are good because they conduct themselves in a way that is sort of mechanically procreative, in contrast to human beings who are lustful, who are not who are not ordered by their natural desires. But in doing this, I think Will is not having the epiphany that some critics take him to be having.
Yeah.
Because the good of the animals is not the same good as the good that is purposed for mankind. So again, it's about hierarchy, and teleology is particular to each stage of the hierarchy. And Will is mistaking the mechanical behavior of the animals for something that he should aspire to, whereas actually he should aspire to a different good. And this is a moment where I think it comes immediately after a passage of him falling into sin himself. So he's led away by a maiden called Concupiscia Canis. So I think this exemplifies that experience of the diabolical by seeing a lesser good and mistaking it for a higher good.
Great. Thank you so much, Conor.
Thanks very much.